In the early weeks of 2026, the world's eyes turned toward Uganda. Millions of our brothers and sisters stood in lines, navigating the complexities of the modern ballot box. We watched the tallying, the political debates, and the tension that often surrounds the formal public sphere in contemporary Africa. The international headlines speak of mandates, of percentages, of majorities and minorities. They frame our political journey through a very specific lens, a lens that insists that democracy is merely the act of casting a paper into a box, where 51% claims absolute victory over 49%. But to understand this moment, to truly comprehend the political soul of our continent, we must step away from the headlines. We must look past the metrics of the present day and journey back. We must go back before the interruption. Long before the ballot box was introduced to our shores as the sole measure of our political will, we were a people of profound, deeply rooted democratic traditions. We are not a people struggling to learn the concepts of governance and representation. We are a people who mastered them millennia ago. The current events we see today are merely a single chapter in an ancient, ongoing story. When we look at modern elections, we are looking at the remnants of a system imposed upon us. But the true African political spirit, the DNA of our governance, is far older, far more sophisticated, and far more inclusive than what the evening news portrays. To understand today, we must honor yesterday. Before the interruption, our ancestors understood a fundamental truth about human existence. It is captured perfectly in the Nguni Bantu philosophy of Ubuntu. Umuntu, Ngumuntu, Gabantu. I am because we are. This was not merely a poetic proverb, it was the supreme constitutional law of our lands. It was the blueprint for our social, economic, and political lives. In the pre-colonial African worldview, the individual did not exist in a vacuum, and therefore political power could not be hoarded by the few at the absolute expense of the many. Consider the majestic Lukiko of the Buganda Kingdom or the Oyomesi Council of the Grand Oyo Empire. These were highly structured, sophisticated representative bodies. Our ancestors did not practice the adversarial winner-takes-it-all politics that currently dominate the globe. They practiced participatory democracy. They governed through consensus. In societies from the Ashanti with their Asetinakese, to the Igbo with the Amaala, to the Somali Gurti and the Shona Dare, the mechanism of decision-making was the council. Democracy the African way did not mean rushing to a vote to silence the minority. It meant sitting under the shade of the great baobab tree, engaging in rational, often lengthy dialogue. It meant that every voice held weight. The elders would speak, the commoners would speak, the women's councils would speak, until an agreement, a mutual accommodation was reached. The goal was not dominance, the goal was harmony. The goal was to ensure that when a decision was finally made, it was owned by the entire community. And what of our leaders? Western history often paints a false portrait of the African absolute monarch, but our ancestors knew better. The chief, the king, the fon, the kabaka, they were not dictators ruling by whim, they were custodians. They were bound by strict oaths to the ancestors, to the land, and to the people. A leader who violated the sacred trust of the community, who ignored the counsel of the elders, could be destooled, removed, or held spiritually and physically accountable. We invented checks and balances. We invented the decentralized distribution of power. This was our brilliance. This was the governance Africa had long before the first foreign ships appeared on our horizons. Then came the interruption. The era of colonialism did not just steal our resources and our people, it attempted to dismantle the very architecture of our societies. Artificial borders were drawn across our maps, slicing through ancient kingdoms, separating families, and forcing disparate groups into administrative zones designed for extraction, not for consensus. The foreign powers imposed their own courts, their own parliaments, and their own adversarial systems of law. They sought to replace the baobab tree with the magistrate's bench, to replace Ubuntu with extreme, competitive individualism. but they fundamentally misunderstood the strength of the African spirit. You can burn the physical council house, but you cannot burn the philosophy of the people. Our ancestors adapted, they survived. While the colonial administrations built their formal public sphere, the governor's mansions and the colonial courts, our people maintained the informal public sphere. Beneath the surface of foreign rule, the invisible networks of elder councils, the secret societies, the family heads and the village chiefs continued to operate. When the formal courts failed us, our people still went to the elders to resolve their disputes through restorative justice. When the imposed economic system sought to starve us, our people relied on the ancient practices of communal labor, the Ilima and the Letsema, to harvest the crops and feed our children. We survived the darkest chapters of human history, not by adopting the ways of the conqueror, but by fiercely protecting the inner sanctuary of our communal law. This is the continuity of our greatness. This is our true triumph. During the fierce struggles for independence across the continent, it was not Western political theory that fueled our liberation. It was the reawakening of our ancestral solidarity. The leaders of our independence movements tapped into the deep, unbroken well of communalism. They realized that the only way to break the chains of the interruption was to remember who we were. We stood together across artificial borders, united by a shared history and a shared destiny. The resilience of the African governance system is that it lives in the blood, not just in the buildings. Today, the legacy of Ubuntu is not merely a relic of the past, it is a living, breathing blueprint for our future. As we navigate the complexities of the 21st century, from the bustling streets of Kampala to the global diaspora, we are witnessing a profound cultural revival. We are recognizing that the solutions to our modern challenges do not lie in perfectly mimicking the systems that interrupted us. The solutions lie in our own indigenous intelligence. Look closely at our continent today. In the aftermath of conflicts, when the Western models of punitive justice prove hollow, we return to the wisdom of our ancestors. We see it in the Gacaca courts, in traditional truth and reconciliation processes, where the goal is not merely to punish, but to heal the community and restore harmony. We see it in our economic lives, where modern cooperative movements and digital micro-lending platforms are simply the technological evolution of our ancient communal saving rings and shared labor practices. And look at our youth. The brilliant, dynamic young people of Africa and the diaspora carry the DNA of consensus. When they organize, when they demand accountability from their leaders, they are not asking for a foreign concept of democracy. They are demanding the return of the African standard. They are building new digital baobab trees, creating spaces for dialogue, mutual respect, and collective action. They understand intuitively that a leader is a servant of the people, a custodian of the future. This living legacy extends across the oceans. To our brothers and sisters in the diaspora, Ubuntu is the unbreakable tether that binds us. It is the communal spirit that allowed African descendants in the Americas, the Caribbean, and Europe to build thriving communities, to create culture that moves the globe, and to survive in systems designed for their failure. The philosophy of "I am because we are" is the greatest export the African continent has ever given the world. It is a philosophy of supreme social technology. So, when we observe the elections in Uganda or any political event unfolding on our great continent, let us not be discouraged by the friction of the formal public sphere. Let us not judge our progress solely by the metrics of the interruption. A ballot box is a tool, but it is not the totality of our democratic soul. The true measure of our success is our journey back to our center. It is our application of the Sankofa principle, reaching back to gather the best of what our ancestors taught us and bringing it forward to build tomorrow. We must infuse our modern institutions with the spirit of consensus, with the unwavering demand for communal well-being, and with the deep accountability of the elder councils. We are not a people struggling to learn how to govern ourselves. We are a people remembering how we once governed with unparalleled grace and preparing to teach that profound wisdom to the rest of the world. Our history is not a shadow, it is a celestial fire, and that fire still burns in us all.